Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PB Political Podcast. I'm Eshan Pokhrel,
I'm Michael Bodeker.
and today we're back with the Road to 2024, as we ended up calling it, where we go back into American history and delve into important elections that really shaped where we are as a country and where we are today in the political moment of our country. And today we're going back to maybe my favorite election, just from the chaos of it, the election of 1800. This one is a doozy. I'm excited to cover this one. I don't know about you, Bodeker, but this one's one that we've always heard about. Again, really through Hamilton. Shout out to Hamilton for giving us such an insight to early American history, be it accurate
Shout
or
out
not.
Manuel Miranda. Shout out to him.
Shout out to Manuel Miranda. Always welcome on the podcast. But yeah, election of 1800. This one, again, a doozy. So we had the two main candidates. We're going to get right into this here. Thomas Jefferson, the failed candidate in 1796 and the former Secretary of State under George Washington, against the incumbent president, John Adams. This is the first election. This is the first election where the president is running as an incumbent against a competition. So, because obviously George Washington did not really have real competition. This is also the first, and more famously, this is the first election and only election to this day to be determined by Congress. And that was decided not between Jefferson and Adams, even though that was the two names at the top of the ticket. This was decided between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. We're going to get much more into that later on and explain the whole process of what happened then. And another thing that we kind of touched on last week, Thomas Jefferson won the popular vote with over 60% of the vote. So John Adams, not very popular, and you could kind of tell, obviously, just by the sheer margin of victory at the popular vote level for Thomas Jefferson. So let's just get to the issues here, Bodeker. You can take out the issues, yeah? Go ahead.
Sure. Let me go ahead. So this was in a weird way, this was the first, I guess if 1796 was the introduction to modern elections, this was the first modern election by all accounts. You could have this election in some ways today, and it would not be too far apart from something that we would be used to. It was bitter. It was not amicable. Just personal attacks. There's just everyone is angry. There's like 7 people campaigning, and people are backstabbing, and everything that we're probably used to these days. The Federalists claimed that Democratic Republicans and Jefferson were atheists because of their support for the French. Federalists wanted better relations with the British, and that came into conflict. And Adams was attacked by, Jefferson supporters and high Federalists who were aligned with Hamilton, and Jefferson and Burr had all these complex dynamics, and Adams and Jefferson didn't like each other. And then Hamilton is trying to, collaborate with all of these people and kind of focus on his own political power, basically scheming to get Pinckney elected instead of Adams, which backfired and hurt Hamilton and the Federalists long term. And then Burr is just smart electorally, pretty stupid everywhere else. That's probably the way I could categorize Burr. A bit of an electoral genius, but not smart
No.
once he actually got into office.
Nope. And I mean, what a campaign. I mean, like reading through and doing the research for this earlier today, I was just like laughing the whole way. I mean, like this stuff. So Hamilton, again, he basically ran a coup against Adams, trying to get the vice presidential candidate, Charles Pinckney, into office, which backfired. And again, Hamilton was already politically declining. Obviously, most of his political clout was with George Washington, and it's been like, what, 4 years at this time since George Washington's been in office. He's kind of on the outs. So he tries to get back in, and this backfired so badly, the whole party collapsed, basically. This is like one of the biggest failures in American history. It's crazy. And then again, Aaron Burr was Jefferson's campaign manager and vice presidential nominee. And he's also scheming against him once we get to the actual meat of this election. So there's so much going on. There's not as many foreign storylines this time as there were last time. I guess the country stabilized a little bit more, even though Adams had a rough presidency. But a lot of this is very similar. The mudslinging, the slander, the personal attacks, a lot of it is reminiscent to recent elections, especially 2016 and 2020. And let's get into the election. Oh my goodness. So first thing that I learned personally, I didn't even know this going into this research, this election, the voting started from April of 1800 and lasted all the way through October. So the traditional voting, like the election day of being the first Tuesday of every November, that wasn't set by Congress until 1845. So states were at their own discretion to pick when they wanted to vote in the calendar year, with obviously some restrictions. Some of the restrictions I read clearly did not apply to 1800 because this is a long stretch of time. This is 7 months, 8 months of the year where voting took place. So that's the first thing. Going into the election. Post-election, because obviously all this stuff is happening. Post-election, we're getting into the ballot counting, February 1801. Georgia, the state of Georgia certificate of election was like a very big controversy at the time because it did not actually follow the constitutionally mandated form for stating official elections. Despite this, Thomas Jefferson, who was the vice president at the time, and if you guys remember anything from 2020, the vice president is in charge of counting electoral votes and certifying them. He counted the votes in favor of Jefferson and Burr, so himself and Burr. And it is Burr and Jefferson were the ones that were on the name of the letter, so they were the ones that were elected. However, with the form being a little off, there could have been legal challenges to this, and this is obviously a very big quick connection to 2020 with Vice President Mike Pence counting the votes, while former President Donald Trump was actively telling him not to count the votes or count them for him. And even in Georgia, hey, Georgia was a big part. The parallels are kind of crazy because Georgia had a big part to play in 2020. Big part in 1800. So let's get Bodeker, you want to just, I don't even like, do you want to get into the whole, what was going on with, like, what would have happened if Georgia's ballots were disputed?
So this is just weird, right? Because we've had some electoral controversies. This one is huge. 2000, the Hanging Chads, Bush versus Gore. 2020, another one, 12,000 votes in Georgia. And, whether the vice president can nullify a state's electoral votes or change the outcome of those votes. So, had those ballots been rejected, and it is worthy noting that Georgia didn't follow it necessarily on the inside of the envelope they mailed the ballots, but they had it correct on the outside.
Yeah.
So it's a weird technicality.
Yeah, it's just odd.
Yeah,
a lot of
odd. So then they would have been short of the majority, Jefferson and Burr, by one vote, meaning that the presidency would have been decided in an election between 5 candidates, or in Congress between 5 candidates: Adams, Pinckney, Jefferson, Burr, and John Jay, who got
so
would have been out.
Oh. Yeah, let me just go through this real quick before I get into contingent elections. So again, from last week, if you guys remember, or if you didn't listen, which you should listen to that episode, at this point in American history, each elector had 2 votes, one for vice president, one for president. John Adams was so unpopular that he got less votes than the vice president did for president. So Aaron Burr, the vice president for Thomas Jefferson, got more votes for president than Thomas Jefferson did. And that one vote for John Jay was a vice presidential vote to be on Adams' ticket instead of Pinckney, just for the record. So, yeah, if there was no majority, it would have been between the candidates that got electoral votes, which means all 5 of these candidates would have to go to Congress, probably not John Jay, but the other 4 would have to go to Congress to try to get them to vote them to be the president of the United States. Let's get into the contingent election. This is the craziest thing that can happen, and probably the most chaotic thing that can happen in presidential election, most presidential elections maybe ever. So
it is also important first. So the reason that they voted for Jay, the Federalists screwed up, or the Democratic Republicans screwed up bad. They were supposed to have somebody defect from voting for Burr. So Jefferson and Burr were not supposed to tie. somebody was supposed to vote for another Democratic Republican or even John Jay or just anyone but the main four people, and Jefferson would have won. But they messed up and everybody voted for Jefferson and it caused all of these problems and it was a disaster.
This is the type of thing, like this type of just pure like I don't even like just fuck up. I guess we can curse. Is something that is so likely to happen. I can see it happening, especially these last 8 years. I can see it happening like so like just happening. Everyone be like, oh, of course. And yeah, the parallels between these early elections and just like how they've shaped how everything's happened moving forward is kind of insane. Let's do the contingent election. So to get to a contingent election, no candidate has to hit the majority. So now in 2024 or 2023 right now, but it would have to be no candidate hits 270 electoral votes. So that can mean a third party gets in. That can mean electors don't vote the way they're intended to. Faithless electors, we've seen that before. Not in a way that was swinging an election, but we have seen that happen before, notably in 2016. So no candidate would get to 270. In this, no candidate got to so Canada did get to 70 here, obviously, but they were tied. So that makes it an issue. So they got to the majority, but they tied. So now the House of Representatives has to choose between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. This is where it gets crazy. So the House was controlled by Federalists at this point, and obviously, since there's an election happening, they were on the way out with the Democratic Republicans coming in to run the Congress, but this is their last act because they can't swear a new Congress in until this is all figured out. So the Federalists hate Thomas Jefferson, for obvious reasons, being just an opposition party, a leader, obviously all of that. So a lot of the Federalists decided to vote Burr out of spite. So out of the 8 states controlled by Federalists in the House, 6 of them cast their ballots for Aaron Burr. The 7 states controlled by the Democratic Republicans voted for Jefferson, and Georgia had 1 representative. They were a Federalist. He was a Federalist, I should say, and he voted for Jefferson. So 8 states voted for Jefferson, 6 for Burr, and 2 states, Vermont and Maryland, did not vote for either. They cast blank ballots. So there were 16 states in Congress at this time. You have to get to 9 to get to a simple majority to become the president. Nothing happened to the first ballot. 35 ballots later, this isn't changed. So this changed once after the first ballot, but there was no change in like Jefferson become president or Burr become president. Throughout all of this, Alexander Hamilton, who is probably devastated at this point now that the Federalists are basically on the way out, essentially, he starts urging Federalist members of the House to vote for Jefferson because he was, this is a quote, by far not so dangerous a man as Burr. So, Bodeker, can you just explain what he was saying there? Just like, can you like break it down for everybody?
It's just, Burr is this character that is just manipulative, and he is, even in Hamilton, which is not. It's a little bit exaggerated from the true history, but it tells the true historical tale is that Hamilton thinks Burr is greedy and he is power hungry, and as much as he hates Jefferson, he would rather have Jefferson, who he believes has the wrong ideas, than he believes that Burr has no principle whatsoever. So someone that he thinks is wrong versus someone that has no concept of right or wrong in general. And that is a really, really strong thing to say about somebody. And so the fact that Hamilton, disliking both of these men, campaigned so hard for Jefferson says a lot about his relationship with Burr.
Yeah, there was a lot of vitriol there. So this is all happening. I didn't mention this is all happening in the span of 1 week. So February 11th was when the first ballots were cast in the House. February 17th, 6 days later, I guess 7 if you want to count it like that, the House has cast 35 ballots on the issue of President of the United States. And every single time it's been 8 states for Jefferson, 6 for Burr, 2 blank. On the 36th ballot, the representative from Delaware, the gentleman James Byard, changed his vote from Aaron Burr to no selection. and he was joined by Federalists in Maryland and in Vermont, which were two states that voted for Burr, and they're Federalist controlled. So by these Federalists counting or casting blank ballots, that means that there's basically had 0 Federalists voting for Burr, and the Democratic Republicans of those states voted for Jefferson. This gave Jefferson 2 more states, so he got 10 states, and that's enough to get to a majority, and he became the president of the United States with Aaron Burr as his vice president. A wild, like, I mean, like, what a crazy. I don't know what happened.
You know what's even more of a disaster? The Democratic Republicans had to have been so nervous because either Burr, the Federalists can help Burr win, which is probably not what they wanted, or they could refuse to break the deadlock. They just keep voting the same way, and then guess who's president? I had no idea about this. Secretary of State John Marshall, who then goes on to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for like 30 years, would have been acting president. What?
Yeah, this is just, I mean, I don't even know. Like, there's so many. So yeah, like Burr, Federalists wanted Burr. The whole time, Democratic Republicans, I think you said this, wanted Jefferson as the president, Burr as the vice president. So to have a complete switch of that brought on by a party that's dying at this point, I don't know, it's crazy. And then John Marshall would have ran that. He would have been the first Taft president and Chief Justice. I mean, God, what a time. All of this leads to the 12th Amendment, which clearly defined how, basically, the 12th Amendment allowed a president to choose a running mate. And I believe there's just, I don't know the exact language, but in essential, the president and the vice president aren't voted on, like, they aren't voted on individually by the electors. So you'll be voting for both a president and a vice president with your electoral ballot. Although I guess there has to be a scenario, and this is a pure hypothetical, where, like, let's say from 2020, Joe Biden wins a state. Let's say Joe Biden won Alabama, but then Mike Pence won the vice presidential vote. So would they split that? How would that even work? Do you know? Like, that's something where it gets gray. That's never happened before, as far as I could tell.
I don't even know. I mean, that's such an intricate. I gotta be honest. If this happened now, there would be I think genuine political violence. I mean,
It's possible.
There's no way that these people were able to be like, you know what, this is all going to be just fine.
This is fine.
It's chaos.
I agree. I think that's why I find a little bit of it's just awe. I honestly awe, AWE in this, what happened in 1800. This is never going to be able to, I'm sure it was rough in 1800. I don't think this would be crazy. This would be a red line for a lot of people in 2024. If President Biden, there's I'm not saying there's a real possibility, but there is a chance a third party candidate can win electoral votes, especially with how unpopular both of these presumptive candidates are. At this stage, it's obviously too early to tell on both sides, but let's say President Trump, President Biden are the nominees. I mean, they both have legal troubles coming their way. I mean, Biden has big legal trouble coming his way. President Trump already has a lot of trouble. They're both unpopular, and they're both old, which is a big problem for a lot of voters, myself included, I will say. Third-party candidate could do damage. Now, obviously, there's a lot of intricacies with that. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. But I think this type of scenario is it's really pure, this is the most ounce of democracy you can squeeze out of the republic to pick a president. It's kind of insane.
I mean, just I'm also going to add to the political implications of a Jefferson presidency versus a Burr presidency or Adams second term. This, I may go out on a limb and say, other than maybe 1860 with Lincoln, this may be the most consequential election in American history for a lot of reasons. I mean, an amendment because of this election. I mean, just the stark difference between Jefferson and I think what would have been a Burr presidency or what would have been an Adams second term, and just everything that Jefferson stood for.
Yeah,
it's remarkable on its impact on American history.
Let's get into
election politics.
Yeah, let's get into the Jefferson. Before we get into the Jefferson presidency, I just want to shout out Aaron Burr for, after losing the election, becoming vice president. I believe he ran for governor of New York in 1804, so this might have been after his term. And then after that, didn't he like denounce his American citizenship and try to like buy land out west and start a kingdom or something? A lot of crazy stuff, you know.
Yeah, he had been rumored to have been plotting with some Western states to secede for an independent empire or to raise a filibuster to conquer Mexico.
Hey, shout out to Aaron Burr for being a forward-thinking and very, you have to have guts, is all I'm going to say about that. And yeah, so shout out to Aaron Burr for being different, I guess. No one was doing it like him, that's for sure. No one was losing as many elections as he was. But with that in mind, let's go into what we both consider to be one of the better administrations, maybe, of American history, the Jefferson administration. Bodeker, hit the high points. What did Thomas Jefferson do?
Oh, man. Where do I start? So this is the first election in American history where there is a transition between opposing political parties, a first peaceful transition between opposing political parties. And guess what? It starts with a bang. We talked last episode about the midnight judges appointed by John Adams. Turns out those are going to be really important soon. Jefferson's inaugurated in Washington, D.C. I believe he's the first president to be inaugurated in Washington, D.C. as well. Jefferson, never known. He's maybe the most eloquent writer in the history of the world. Not a great speaker. I kind of can't blame him for that. And then Adams actually did not attend the ceremony. We have heard that one before. And then Jefferson built his own cabinet. Albert Gallatin, whose statue is outside the Secretary of the Treasury in D.C. Henry Dearborn, I believe the namesake of Dearborn, Michigan. Attorney General is Levi Lincoln, and Secretary of the Navy was Robert Smith. Burr, after his decision to the presidency, was excluded from any role in Jefferson's administration. And Gallatin and Madison were the two people that were just unbelievably influential. And Madison is Secretary of State. He is the father of the Constitution. He's kind of a mini Jefferson in a lot of ways. They were just unbelievably influential. And additionally, too, I didn't know this, but Jefferson was not a fan of patronage or the spoils system. He maintained pretty much the Federalists that were working in the federal government didn't have a problem with them unless they were engaged in misconduct or being openly partisan. He refused to call for complete replacement. First person to do that was Andrew Jackson in 1828, probably because he was bitter about the corrupt bargain and a lot of other stuff. We'll get there when we get there.
Next week, actually. That's next week.
So Adams, we'll get back to these judges. Jefferson and his allies sought to reverse the Judiciary Act of 1801, which was passed by the Federalists still in Congress at the time, to get rid of these midnight judges, to make their appointments null and void. And the Federalists opposed this, of course, because they would have been Federalists, and they argued that Congress didn't have the power to abolish occupied judicial positions. However, the Democratic Republicans passed the Judiciary Act of 1802, which had basically restored most of the provisions of the judicial system before the 1801 Act. And they had refused to deliver some commissions to Adams' appointees who had won Senate confirmation but had not taken office. One of those was, everyone knows, everyone's favorite person, William Marbury, namesake of Marbury versus Madison, sued Secretary of State Madison to compel him to deliver the Senate-confirmed commissions. And in 1803, we get, I will argue, probably the most important case in the history of the United States. Marbury versus Madison, court rules against Marbury, but also says, you know what, we had judicial review and we can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional.
Actually, we're recording this Wednesday, so a little early. This is just referenced by the Supreme Court in their ruling in North Carolina's redistricting, I believe. So it's still the test of time for sure.
Yeah. And then, so Jefferson gets 3 picks to the Supreme Court. And a lot of his picks pretty much echo Marshall. He doesn't like that. He wasn't a fan of Marshall. At least his judicial ethos, I would say. And then here's something else: the Jeffersonian democracy. We hear a lot of Jacksonian democracy and probably a lot of democracy with Lincoln. Jeffersonian democracy is the first, I would say, real democratic movement in America in terms of the republic, which Jefferson is much more of an agrarian kind of guy, small federal government. Jefferson believed in, this political equality. The Federalists were a little bit more elitist, arguing that kind of the rich and powerful should lead, while Jefferson kind of argued that the common man has a role to play in the political system, which was, even revolutionary, but we've known that about Jefferson since the Declaration of Independence. That was nothing new. And there's a lot of evidence out there that voter turnout in this time was super low, like 5 to 10%. But with, the rise of two-party systems and, there was this voter in Jeffersonian democracy of encouraging the common man and making voting easier. Voter participation turned from, 20% in the 1790s to nearly 80% during Jefferson's presidency, which is unbelievable. I mean, indentured servitude decreased during his administration. Jefferson accepted visitors without regard to social status and economic status. He stopped delivering speeches to Congress in person, which is probably part of Jeffersonian democracy, but also his lack of desire to speak in public. He just wasn't a big speaker. He was less formal at White House events. This is the rise of modern party organization. Jefferson was a real I would say he's a very fiscally conservative, wanting to balance budget.
The first real opportunity for anybody to be fiscally conservative in the United States, I would say too. Because Adams was, you had to grow the country, and I think Jefferson. You even mentioned the Louisiana Purchase yet, but he definitely instilled fiscal responsibility into the country like at the early stage. Because I don't think this would have been a thing otherwise.
Yeah, he destroys the Alien and Sedition Acts and pardoned all 10 people who had been prosecuted under them. Tried to dismantle Hamilton's National Bank. Gallatin stepped in and said, "Let's try and keep that," which Jefferson begrudgingly accepts, of course. So many Americans don't really have any contact with the federal government, except for the Postal Service. But Jefferson wanted to abolish the national debt because he believed it was dangerous and immoral. Unbelievable, especially for the modern day. I don't think that even, I would say now that there is a political ideology in America that even says it even goes that far. It really is deficit spending from both parties. So to see real goals to abolish the national debt is something that is unthinkable in the modern day. He shrank the size of the Army and Navy. Didn't really think they were necessary in peacetime. He didn't want to provoke foreign hostilities. He had reduced the national debt by basically a third. And after believing that we would get rid of our national debt, then he was like, you know what? Because we're getting rid of our debt, we might actually be able to have a little bit of a larger army now, and do some internal improvements and education. But those weren't acted on by Congress, unfortunately, probably. And then there was he also green lights Louisiana Purchase for, I think it was $15 million from Napoleon. And then green lights, the Lewis and Clark expedition. So it's this massive land purchase that, basically builds the road for the next 40 or 50 years of American exploration and construction and industrialization, the early industrialization. Just unbelievably influential. Lewis and Clark, geography, botany, learning about, what we actually have bought from the French, and that it wasn't a load of garbage. Now, there was one scandal, the Yazoo land scandal. Georgia had been basically engaged in real estate fraud by selling large tracts of Yazoo land before passing a law that invalidated those grants. So basically the federal government purchased Western Georgia. It agreed to extinguish all the Native American claims. And then Jefferson sought to compensate those that were defrauded by giving them some of the lands acquired. It started kind of some factionalism, the Democratic Republicans, that proved problematic for Jefferson and his successors.
But even that, I will say that was like basically all Georgia. That was Governor Matthews in Georgia, if I remember correctly. That was a lot of Georgia, and that led into Fletcher versus Peck, right, in 1810, maybe. I think that was a Fletcher case. But yeah, no, that wasn't even like I wouldn't even like chalk that up to Jefferson at the start, which is kind of amazing.
There's some other awesome stuff Jefferson does. He establishes West Point with the Military Peace Establishment Act of 1802, founds the United States Military Academy at West Point. You know, that has been the most influential school of military leaders in the history of it. I mean, that has been the foundational school for the vast majority of American high military command since its founding. You know, even, you know, Robert E. Lee, who goes on to, you know, be extremely influential for the United States and then the Confederacy, went to West Point, nearly top of his class. I believe Grant went to West Point. Most people
went to West Point.
West Point. Pershing, I believe, was West Point as well. Eisenhower, Patton.
Yeah,
you know, an unbelievable amount of American military leaders and some of the greatest generals in the history of the world.
Yeah,
go through West. That's a Jefferson thing.
Yeah.
And then we go through the 12th Amendment. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Everyone is pretty angry about what happened in 1800. So it was ratified, and the president had no role in that, but it was definitely something that worked to improve the electoral process. Jefferson brings Ohio into the United States during his administration in 1803. Yeah, so 1803. It was, the funny thing is that an official statehood date for Ohio was not passed until 1953. So I guess Ohio technically was not a state.
Well, it just bolsters the claims that Ohio isn't real. And I'm sorry if you live in Ohio, because you don't. But yeah, I mean, I'm just saying.
Not until 1953.
Yeah, even that. I mean, it was.
But Jefferson is this Empire of Liberty figure, just an unbelievably smart gentleman. And, you know, Louisiana Purchase opens the way also for us to purchase Spain and the Adams-Onis Treaty. It was, I believe, negotiated by Monroe. He tried to pass the Embargo Act of 1807 to force Europe to comply and forbid trade with both France and Britain. And that didn't really work. And, you know, it really didn't stop Britain from treating us poorly. The first Barbary War, you know, he kind of succeeded in making the Barbary pirates stop harassing us quite as much. The funny thing is I think it was Lieutenant Stephen Decatur led a successful raid on Tripoli's harbor, becoming a national hero. I would assume he's the namesake of a local town for us, Decatur, Alabama. I assume that's probably named after Lieutenant Stephen Decatur. Yeah, Stephen Decatur. And obviously Napoleon needed money for his colonial empire, sells us Louisiana territory, nearly doubles the size of the country. Treasury Secretary Gallatin was forced to borrow from foreign banks to finance the payment to France. It was just an unbelievably savvy purchase. Gotta give it to them.
So that was like 5 minutes straight of just positives about Thomas Jefferson. It's kind of crazy. But I will say it is fair. I mean, he had some issues, obviously, we talked about. And it's obviously tough to, like, look at the lens of history and just be like, yeah, he has slaves, he's a bad person. Obviously, not great, not good at all to have slaves. He did sign he did announce the international slave trade. I see you put that down. That's a little interesting, considering his history with slaves. And he did work with Congress to pass the act prohibiting importations of slaves in 1806, and so that's always good, I guess. Yeah.
Well, that's the funny thing about Jefferson, right? Is he's a man of contradictions to some extent. Like with slavery, it seems to me from all that I've read of Jefferson and the things people have wrote about Jefferson didn't like slavery. He didn't. And clearly he did. We know now. I mean, I think they probably even knew then that he liked one of his slaves, pretty personally. So, you know, it's just a weird contradiction, and he's not here for us to ask him about it.
And yeah, that's what people need to remember. I'd say, just for anybody, say 1800s, it's really the 1700s. There's a lot of things that you can't answer through the lens of history and look back on with objective views. But I mean, yeah, no, he definitely was a man. He was a very interesting man. Definitely one of the more successful presidencies. Obviously, Louisiana Purchase being probably the most well known and probably the most longest standing that he did, I'd say, just because the way it opened up to us to, getting California in, Oregon, Washington, Texas, the flyover states, everything. I mean, yeah, I would say President Jefferson was one of the more successful presidents, but the way he got into office, and obviously in 1804, he had no chance of losing, but 1800, oh my goodness. What am I?
And there's even more. Like, for example, the Burr conspiracy. We haven't even gotten into that yet.
Let's do it. Let's talk about Aaron Burr before we get out of here. We need to mention him. We need to talk about him.
So Burr gets dropped from the 1804 Democratic Republican ticket, gets mad, says, you know what, guys, I'm going to run for governor of New York. We forget, and I'm pretty sure who lives in New York at this time, Alexander Hamilton. Turns out these guys don't like each other. Burr didn't forget what happened to him in 1800. And Hamilton schemes on Burr's defeat, makes a bunch of not nice remarks about Burr. So Burr gets angry and says, you know what, Alexander, let's have a duel. And so then we all know the story. We hawk in at dawn. Burr mortally wounds Hamilton. Burr gets indicted for the murder of Hamilton, and in New York and New Jersey, causes them to flee to Georgia. But what's really funny is that he remained president of the Senate during Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase's impeachment trial. That's kind of hilarious. And then those indictments kind of went away. But then, after this, Burr says, you know what, guys, I'm going to go here for crazy. The British ambassador goes and says, you know what, guys, Burr wants to secede and build a new empire. And everybody's like, what is going on here? So, there were reports of Burr recruiting men and getting arms and building boats. Like, Burr's like, dictator Burr, like, what is happening here? And Jefferson's like introducing like a warning proclamation, like, guys, what is going on? And then Burr gets arrested in 1807, placed on trial for treason. John Marshall's presiding over the trial. This is unbelievable. The governor had a weak case somehow. This leads to Burr's acquittal, but Burr's never taken seriously for the rest of his life. I mean, he died in 1836. He had 30 years of his life where he could talk and somebody just laughs at him.
Well, I think he moved to England, actually. So I don't think he did.
He died in Staten Island.
I think he moved to England for a time, and then he must have came back. I don't know. I mean, he did try the whole, I mean, what a. It's always, it's just a crazy what if we had a President Burr. I don't think we would have. I mean, maybe eventually we'd have the rest of the contiguous United States, but I mean, I don't think Aaron Burr. I think everybody agrees that Aaron Burr would not have matched anywhere close. I don't even know what he would have done, honestly. Like, I can't point to a single thing that he would have just, really have a long-standing legacy, honestly. And, that's just something that...
To give Hamilton credit, you can see what he means when he says, I may not agree with Jefferson, but he has principles. We still don't know what Burr stands for.
Who knows, man?
To this day, we're all still confused on what is Aaron Burr doing. So let's wrap up these last two things on Jefferson. So we've got slave trade, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked about this. There was a lot of optimism during this time that slavery would eventually just crumble. In terms of either the economics, the morality, the growing fear of slave rebellions in the South leads to them not really wanting to abolish slavery. Additionally, the invention of the cotton gin also, I would say, revives slavery to a great extent, meaning that,
that was later on, I think, right? But yeah.
The cotton gin was 1794.
Oh, really? Oh, damn. I didn't know when he was alive then. Okay.
So, the states begin to enact these black codes, horrible, designed to restrict the behavior of free blacks. And Jefferson was actually disappointed the fact the younger generation was not doing more in terms of the business and the practice of slavery, which I find really interesting, especially, another contradiction of Jefferson. Maybe could he have done more? We don't know. And then obviously passes that Slave Trade Act, prohibiting the slave trade in the United States, a very good thing. And then, so we'll get into, 1804, Burr gets kicked off. Burr and Clinton, or Hamilton, or Jefferson and George Clinton of New York win easily, 162 out of 174 electoral votes, not close. 1808 comes around. Jefferson, the beast of a man that he is, believed that incumbents shouldn't serve indefinitely, follows that two-term precedent Washington established, and endorses his buddy James Madison. And, it took all of Jefferson to convince his party to vote for Madison, but, Madison eventually did it and defeats Charles Pinckney, who would basically run for president at that point, 3 times?
Yeah,
already.
I think it's 3 or 4 times.
So, Jefferson, and to summarize the election of 1800, they're the first really ultra-modern election in some ways. And then it's followed up by, I would argue, one of probably the top 5, if not top 3 greatest presidents in the history of the country. So, a weird election, good consequences, could have been disaster. If Burr, we don't know what would have happened there.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think I agree. President Jefferson's one of the best presidents, just from his effectiveness and his favorability, just from like what he could do with the time he was in. I think easily one of the best presidents of our country. I will say in 1808, and we don't want to touch on these elections. This is the era of good feelings where no one can touch the Democratic Republicans. Why didn't George Clinton ever run for president? I'm surprised he never ran in 1808. He was vice president. He was vice president under James Madison, too. He's the first guy to serve under two.
He did, actually. Believe it or not, he did.
I thought he eventually ran, but he didn't run in 1808, is what I'm saying.
He did run in 1808.
Did he? Okay, maybe
but Jefferson just had to use his stature to just...
Oh, you're right, yes.
Basically beg everybody to not vote for Clinton and vote for Madison.
Well, it is funny. But, yeah, I mean, Jefferson at that point in his career, I think that further cemented the two-term... I will say that does further cement the two-term legacy just by having someone who was obviously as popular as he was also respect President Washington's two-term limit and make that a real tradition moving forward was definitely helped that Democratic Republicans won the presidency moving forward as much as they did, so they could all pull that tradition. And that I think President Jefferson, one of the better presidents, the way he got to the White House, the presidency at that point is crazy. And I think that it's something that definitely, again, the Georgia thing with the electors, the parallels, like they're kind of scary the way they wrap back, and history always comes back around, So,
well, and what's weird, going into the historical reputation of Jefferson, he takes a hit during the Civil War. States' rights turns out maybe not the most popular thing during that time. We can kind of see why. And then, in the late 1900s to the turn of the century, you got, conservatives with Jefferson and democracy and, reaching out to the common man. They thought that led a lot to the populist sentiment of that time, which I can kind of believe. Maybe not the worst thing ever, though. While progressives of that era really sought more of an active federal government than Jefferson envisioned. And what's interesting is that both of those groups actually vindicated Hamilton and not Jefferson. And then Woodrow Wilson, who has no place to talk and is probably a top 5 worst president ever, described Jefferson. Here, listen to this quote: "Though a great man, not a great American." Excuse me, Woodrow. Who were you to speak, sir? I just, he has warmed up. I think Jefferson's gotten a lot more of a warm welcome from history. I think all the way through maybe the last 5 or 10 years, he has taken some flack in the more modern era. Warranted or not, that's up for debate, obviously. But just a really complicated man, complicated legacy, and a complicated it's all very deep and nuanced, and there's so many twists and turns that you can't possibly cover everything. It's unbelievable.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, you put it pretty well. I think this whole hate on Woodrow Wilson is gonna become a thing every episode. We're gonna find a way to weave it in next week. That's what everything for. Yeah, I mean, might as well try. That's right. I mean, that's what everything for the election of 1800. Sorry, it's a longer episode. Hopefully, you stuck through. A lot of content, a lot of crazy stuff happened, and obviously Jefferson had one of the more heavy presidencies, I guess, in terms of impact and also what he's done. So we had to cover that as well to give respect to him. We'll be back next week covering the election of 1824, the corrupt bargain. If you didn't learn about that in history, I would say you should go read it. It's just interesting before our episode next week. Or you can just wait till we explain it in very fun and Woodrow Wilson hating fashion. So, yeah, I mean, that's everything. Thank you guys for listening. Check out the website, socials, all of that. Refer us to your friends and family, anybody you know. I mean, I have nothing else to say. I'm Eshan Pokhrel.
I'm Michael Bodeker.
And goodbye.